All right. So last week we finished up the Queen of Sheba, looking at her characteristics and looking at the account that is, the two accounts, one in Kings and one in Chronicles, that details her visit to Solomon. And we started King Solomon. We noted that his life, the dates for his life are generally estimated around 1000 BC to 930-ish. There's a couple of different variations of that, but it's kind of in that range. And we ended last week noting in 1 Chronicles 22, verses 7 on through verse 10, that as David is speaking to Solomon, excuse me, and he is detailing to Solomon, kind of giving him the charge to build the temple, he goes through and describes a prophecy that God gave him regarding a son that he was going to have. He called for his son Solomon, verse 6, charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, "My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." So is God blaming David for having gone to war, for having slain his thousands of Philistines and so forth, 10,000s of Philistines? I mean, is God saying that that was wrong or sinful for David to have done?
And I used you for this, I'm going to use this guy for this.
Okay. So it's not so much that what David did. I mean, in a lot of ways, in many of the circumstances, David was directed by God to do what he did. So it's not necessarily that this is a slight on David's character. It has more to do with the purpose of the temple being one of peace, being one of recognition of God's mercy and God's sovereignty, God's commandments, and not necessarily that there would be some kind of literal defilement if David did it, but that God wanted the temple to represent peace. And David's reign, even before he was king and then even after he was king, was not one that was particularly peaceful. There was a lot of unrest and a lot of stuff David had to deal with. So, in verse 9, "Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies all around. His name shall be Solomon, for I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever." So as God is telling David about the son he's going to have, this is clearly before Solomon was born, because his name shall be Solomon. And he says in verse 9, "Behold, a son shall be born." This is future tense. It may have been after David took Bathsheba as wife, but it was definitely before Solomon was born. So at some point, David's recounting an event that took place probably 15 years prior. Most of the estimates in terms of Solomon's age at this point was around 14, 15 years old. So it would have been about 15 years at least prior to this that David received this. I don't know if it was God said this in a vision, or if it was in a dialogue with Jehovah, or what. David doesn't specify how this word of the Lord came to him. But I think it's really interesting, because a lot of times we think about individuals who were prophesied birth and whose names were chosen by God, like Isaac and Jesus, and Solomon was one of those as well. I think that's kind of interesting. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. We also note that his name means peaceful. That's what Solomon means, and that's why God, in describing his name, he said his name's going to be Solomon, because during his reign it's going to be peace, and he's going to be a man of peace. We know he was the son of Bathsheba. Some people spell it Bathsheba, or some translations spell it Bathsheba or Bethsheba. Either way is acceptable. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 24 is where we see Solomon was born to David and Bathsheba. He's listed in the lineages of both genealogies of Jesus. both of Mary and of Joseph, both in Matthew 1 and in Luke chapter 3, which kind of gives its own recognition of God, even in times where man does that which is sinful. God still uses their actions to bring about what he wants. Okay, I don't think anybody would defend David for committing adultery with Bathsheba, much less killing Uriah or having Uriah killed, same difference. And yet, the lineage of Jesus came through the union of David and Bathsheba. So does that mean that David's sin with Bathsheba was okay? Because God's overall plan included Jesus coming from that lineage? Does that make David's sin with Bathsheba all right? Yeah. Nathan wouldn't have had to go through all of this saying, this is what God says is going to happen because of the consequences of your actions. All right? And having Uriah killed, all of that's kind of all together. It wasn't that was okay. It's that God uses even the sins of man to still bring about his will. In fact, Paul addresses this issue in Romans when he's kind of acknowledging or foretelling the defense of the Jews, saying, well, our unfaithfulness led to the Messiah, the will of the Lord being done. And so how can God blame us if what we did, even though it was wrong, led to good? And so Paul kind of concludes, well, does that mean that we should do sin that good may come? and no, that's not. And the point is that God knows what man's going to do. He's going to use, yes, man's good, the things that faithful people do for his will, but he's also going to use the sins of man, the mistakes that man makes for his will as well. That doesn't make the sins or mistakes okay. Anything through that? Okay, so David had at least 19 sons. When you put together the sons he had at Hebron, then the sons he had at Jerusalem, there were several different wives involved in that as well. Solomon was not even close to the firstborn. He was one of at least 19 sons, and yet he was established as king by the commandment of God. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, 1 Chronicles 28, and starting in verse, David has gathered all the officers and the tribes and the captains and so forth. In verse 2, David rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brethren and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God, and had made preparations to build it. But God said to me, you shall not build a house for my name, because you've been a man of war and have shed blood. However, the Lord God of Israel chose me above all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever. For he has chosen Judah to be the ruler. And of the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father, he was pleased with me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. Now he said to me, it is your son Solomon who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. Moreover, I will establish his kingdom forever, if he is steadfast to observe my commandments and my judgments, as it is this day." So David, the conversation we looked at back in chapter 22 is the conversation between him and Solomon. But this is before all the armies of Israel and before the captains and the leaders and so forth. And he's telling them that this is what the case is going to be. This is who's going to take over after me. Now, his firstborn, Abnon, I think it was, he died. Okay, and then the second one, which was Adonijah, he tried to take over from Solomon. And I think that's kind of interesting when you look at kind of that count of how all of that happened. But he would have been the next in line. He was the second born, but he was the firstborn who was alive. He was the next son in line. So he just assumed he would be king. But Solomon was king because God said, I want Solomon. Does that mean that God favored Solomon over any of the other sons? Does that mean God is a respecter of persons? Okay, he had a purpose. That doesn't mean that God was showing favoritism. In fact, Paul, again, brings this up to the Romans and saying, why did God choose Jacob over Esau? Okay, before they were even born, God chose Jacob instead of Esau. Esau would have been technically the firstborn, but why did he choose Jacob? Because he did. That was his plan. It's not a slight against Esau. I mean, even before they were born, it's not like they had committed any sin. And yet, God chose Jacob because that was his plan. All right, anything through that? All right, we see back in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 and in verse 5, this is a key component here that I think is interesting because David observes as he's collecting all the stuff for the building of the temple, he's got it all together so that by the time Solomon comes to reign, everything's ready to build the house of the Lord. And so in verse 5, David said, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, famous and glorious throughout all countries. I will now make preparation for it. And so David made abundant preparations before his death. So David recognized that at the time, and of course David is in the last few years of his life here in chapter 22. And so he knows Solomon, whatever age Solomon is at this point, again, most estimates put him in the 14, 15 years old here. And then when he becomes king, maybe he's 17-ish. He was young. He was still relatively very young. And so David acknowledged that he is young and inexperienced. And I think that that's an important point because of what's going to follow as well. Anything through that? All right, we know that Solomon wrote at least Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. Those are particularly labeled as having been written by Solomon. There were many other psalms that he wrote, whether or not some of the ones that are not specifically labeled were written by him or not, we don't know. But he at least wrote Psalm 72 and Psalm 127 in the book of Psalms, as well as the book of Proverbs. And even though Solomon doesn't identify himself specifically as Solomon in Ecclesiastes, most consider him as being the writer of Ecclesiastes. Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it's very clear, I, Solomon. Okay, he addresses himself, he acknowledges himself. Oh, and the Song of Solomon as well. Even though, so for instance, Song of Solomon chapter 1, verse 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Okay, there are some who say, well, it could be because Solomon is mentioned in the Song of Solomon on several occasions, because this is kind of depicting his wedding and so forth. That's why it's the Song of Solomon. But generally speaking, it's considered that the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, was his song because it was his. He wrote it. Okay, it was his authorship. And then again in Ecclesiastes, there are several references to who the writer of Ecclesiastes is. Verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, I mean, technically, going forward, anyone of the tribe of Judah, of the lineage of David, could claim to be the son of David. But given the fact of the content of Ecclesiastes, we're talking about an exceedingly wise and wealthy man, and one that sought to kind of enjoy life and see what we might say the secret of life is, what the meaning of life is. I think this is literal, that this is the son of David, literal son of David. He was king in Jerusalem. And then there's another reference in Ecclesiastes verse 12, chapter 1, verse 12. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that was done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. Some question verse 12, he was king over Israel and Jerusalem. But the key component is that Solomon writing this, he's not writing this as king. He's writing this as a man of wisdom. Thus, the term preacher is used. One who pronounces and speaks wisdom, particularly the wisdom of God. And that being the case, Solomon is being very careful to avoid any royal mandate being perceived from Ecclesiastes. He's speaking this as wisdom from God, not the king of Israel. And so he's separating himself. Not that I, the preacher, I am king over Israel and Jerusalem. He says, I was king over Israel and Jerusalem. It's not that he is no longer at this point. He was until he died. But still, you have this situation that exists where he's separating himself from that role. Thoughts or comments through that? Chapter 2, he says, starting in verse 3, I searched my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, guiding my heart with wisdom, how to lay hold on folly. I made my works great, verse 4. I built myself houses. I planted myself vineyards, gardens, verse 5. Water pools, verse 7. I had male and female servants. And then he says in verse 7, yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. Verse 9, I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. No one after Solomon comes close to this description. So unless there's a king, which wasn't recorded in the recording of the Old Testament in the kings of Israel, which I don't believe is the case, we're talking about Solomon. And I don't think most scholars don't argue with that. They think that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes as well. Thoughts or comments? All right. In 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 23 through 29, this is after the event with the Queen of Sheba, we find that he was richer than all the kings of the earth during his life. We noted, in fact, I think Joe, during the course of our Queen of Sheba study, noted that it's mentioned that many other people came to see Solomon and to hear his wisdom. And starting in verse 23, King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules, at a set rate year by year. Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, verse 27. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. He made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. Even by today's standards, is silver as commonplace as stones in our society? I mean, is silver that abundant in our society right now? I would say no. Even by our standards, this was an extremely wealthy period of time for Israel. All right, and so that describes all the stuff that he was importing, the chariots and the horses and so forth. But it describes him as being the wealthiest king on the earth. And I just think that's amazing, especially for a relatively small kingdom like Israel. Okay, Israel wasn't that big, especially relative to Assyria and eventually what Babylon would become. I mean, we're talking about, just a small kind of city-state area, relatively speaking. And yet Solomon was the richest and wealthiest of all of them. Thoughts or comments through that?
Within that small, you still had like Philistines.
Oh, yeah. You still had these other
Portions of that.
the Egyptians, and then in and around Israel, you had the Hittites and the Philistines, and yeah, you had a lot of these others as well that were around. And of course, Solomon, in his wisdom, was able to manage all of that because during his reign was a reign of peace. There wasn't a lot of war. There wasn't a lot of bloodshed. And that is, for 40 years, he reigned for 40 years and then ultimately was buried in Jerusalem. It says he was buried in the city of David. Okay, there's some debate as to whether or not that was Jerusalem or Bethlehem, which again, Bethlehem is kind of like a suburb of Jerusalem. But regardless, he was buried in the city of David. But 40 years of peace. We'd like to have 40 years of peace, wouldn't we? Anything else through the facts about Solomon? Yes, sir.
I think that one thing we tend to overlook
Yeah.
The archetypal son of the king. And we see that even in the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus, even most of the Jews today still recognize those as prophecies for Solomon. His name means peace. They see him as the Prince of Peace.
Yeah.
But we understand that they're so closely related in their stories and outlines.
Right. And in a lot of ways, Solomon, he was king over physical peace. Jesus was king over spiritual peace. Even Jesus compared himself to Solomon in the sense of wisdom when he referenced the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the South. He says, a greater than Solomon is here. Solomon is the standard bearer for wisdom. I'm greater than Solomon. And of course, God in the flesh would be greater than Solomon.
And he's the one that would rebuild the temple.
Right. That's right. That's right. He would rebuild the temple. Not physically, but spiritually. Yeah. Good point. All right. Anything else? All right. So talking about, the last thing that I mentioned on the facts. He built the first temple in the 4th year of his reign, according to God's commandment, and it took 7 years. We see this in 1 Kings starting in chapter 5. He started in the 4th year of his reign building the temple. It took 7 years to build, so by the 11th year of his reign, he was done. Then he started his own house. 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 10 describes it took 20 years to build the temple and then his palace. It took 13 years for that. Not that he took more care or that his palace was greater than the temple. That's not the point at all. It just took longer. Of course, all of the materials had already been collected for the temple. So he didn't have to do all that collecting for the temple. There was more involved with his palace on the preparation end of it. But I want you to consider that compared to what we looked at in Obadiah, for instance. Okay, when we looked at our sermon lessons from Obadiah and how God was upset with his people because they were tending to their own houses and their own homes, and they were neglecting the house of the Lord. They didn't care about that. They cared more about their own homes. And yet, even before all of that, Solomon, he put his focus and attention on building the house of the Lord first. Even as king, he built the house of the Lord first, then his house. And I think that says something about Solomon's mindset and thought process. Any thoughts through that? All right. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, we see again this situation where David is before all the leaders of the armies and so forth in the commencement of recognizing that God is the one who has selected Solomon to be king. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 28. I can't speak and figure out my chapters at the same time. Okay, there we go. So David's explaining all of this. Here's what God said. Solomon's going to be one to build my house. Therefore, verse 8, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, be careful to seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it as an inheritance for your children after you forever. Then David turns to Solomon. He says, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father, and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. So David offers some wise, sage advice coming from a man after God's own heart, that this is what you should focus on. You are to be completely dedicated and committed to serving the Lord. And God, he knows your heart. He knows your thoughts. If you seek him, he'll be found by you. Then in verse 19, starting in verse 19, he says, all this said David. He talks about the temple and its layout and all the stuff that was going to be involved in the temple and so forth. Then in verse 19 he says, all this said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. And David said to his son Solomon, be strong and of good courage, and do it. Do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you until you have finished all the work for the service of the house of the Lord. And so then he talks about the divisions of the Levites, and so forth. So there's some wise counsel from David. And again, Solomon is 16-ish. Okay, he hasn't passed away yet. He hasn't died yet. But this is, in essence, a coronation. This is recognizing that Solomon is to be king. He's the one who's going to be in charge. And that's what the people are going to understand. But notice also in verse 12, notice how David describes how he received. It wasn't like David brought in architects to determine what this was all going to look like or how it was to be set up. Remember, the tabernacle, it was mobile. Okay, it was with a tent and with poles, especially while the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. The tabernacle of the Lord was meant to be mobile until they came to Jerusalem, ultimately, to the land of Canaan, the promised land, and settled in this land. Then they needed to have a more permanent place for the tabernacle of the Lord. And so David, it says in verse 12, the plans for all that he had, he describes the plans for the vestibule, its houses, its treasuries, its upper chambers, its inner chambers. Verse 12, the plans for all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, of all the chambers all around, of the treasuries of the house of God, the treasuries for the dedicated things. And then again in verse 19, all this the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. This wasn't like David designed all of this himself. Okay, and it wasn't like Solomon designed it. God, in essence, kind of like a blueprint, I guess you could say. This is what I want. This is specifically what I want things made out of. Here's how it's supposed to be set up. And I'm sure it was, at least by layout, was probably identical to the tabernacle, just in permanent form. And it sounds like it was much bigger, obviously, than the tabernacle was as well. But I think that's really interesting. A lot of times we think about David kind of on his own deciding, I'm going to build a temple, and then kind of on his own deciding what it's going to look like. He leaves all the materials for Solomon, and Solomon builds it, and God's just kind of like, what are you doing? You know, I'm not involved in this. Why are you building a temple for me? That wasn't the case. God was directing this. He was deeply involved in the describing of how he wanted things done. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. So even before Solomon received this gift of wisdom from the Lord, he showed great wisdom early on when he became king. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 50 through 52, we see this is during the course of these events with 1 Kings chapter 1. This is the event with Adonijah. Okay, Adonijah, again, he assumes he's going to be king, either because he, didn't hear about what David said about Solomon being king, or he didn't take it seriously, but Adonijah is the next in line to be king, so he just assumed he would be. And both the leader of the army, as well as, in fact, we see in verse, it's Abiathar the high priest, let's see. Abiathar the priest and Joab. That's who I'm thinking of. Verse 7. He conferred with Joab and Abiathar, and they followed and they helped Adonijah. These two were key components of the king, of the court of the king. Well, they, again, whether they hadn't heard that God had chosen Solomon to be king instead of Adonijah or not, they were taking Adonijah. They basically coronated Adonijah. So then they're all together. They're kind of celebrating Adonijah's coroning to the kingship. And then in verse 45 on through verse 49, they hear David has taken, and Samuel has taken Solomon, and they've crowned him king. So, in verse 50, Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar, And it was told to Solomon, saying, Indeed, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, for look, he's taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. Solomon said, If he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So King Solomon sent them to bring him down from the altar. He came down and fell down before King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, Go to your house. Adonijah is his, at this point, eldest brother, half-brother, technically. But he would have been the one in line. But Solomon, again, keep in mind, so Adonijah, he's probably something like 20 years older than Solomon. Okay, if Solomon is in the 16, 17, 18-year-old range, Adonijah is probably in his late 30s, somewhere around there. So, I mean, we're talking a big difference. Here's your little brother, okay, who has been crowned king. Well, Adonijah, after recognizing that this is what's happened, he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Apparently this was because this is actually referenced on several occasions in the Old Testament, grabbing the horns of the altar. Sometimes it's metaphorical, sometimes it's literal. But it's to hold someone to a vow or a promise. And he's literally holding to the horns of the altar as if this connection between God and this promise or vow that's taking place. And he's asking Solomon not to hurt him, not to kill him. And Solomon makes a statement, if you're a worthy person, if there's no wickedness found in you, you'll be fine. Everything will be all right. And so, verse 53, Adonijah bows down before Solomon, acknowledges his kingship, at least in form, okay? And then Solomon says, Go to your house. He lets him live. I think that takes a lot of wisdom, okay, from someone so young, especially having kind of been thrown into this situation where there's this initial, some of the people even were going along with Adonijah as king at first because they just assumed that this is what was going to happen. Again, did people forget that Solomon had been selected by God, but by David, to be king? Or had they not heard? I don't know. But Joab and Abiathar, they were supporting this. They were kind of rooting for Adonijah. They helped coronate him in a fake coronation ceremony. But Solomon, he's the one that ultimately is in charge, and then he lets Adonijah live. I just think that there's a lot of wisdom there coming from someone so young after your eldest brother basically tried to form a coup, okay, or at least a coup against Solomon, who was supposed to be king. Thoughts or comments through that?
If I was one of the brothers, I would unride his coattails.
Yeah.
Healthy and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Great life following him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Of course, they may not have known that at the time, but yeah, absolutely. I would have been fine with that too. All right, then in chapter 2, and we're not going to read all of this account, but it's a really interesting account. If you have time to kind of study during the week to read this, it's really interesting because starting in verse 13, we have a situation where, so David dies, and then Adonijah comes to Bathsheba, the mother of the king. Okay, David's already dead. And Adonijah, the son of Haggith, comes to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. She said, Do you come peaceably? And he said, Peaceably. Moreover, he said, I have something to say to you. And she said, Say it. So keep in mind, Bathsheba is not the mother of Adonijah. Okay, his mother was a different, I think his mother was actually a princess from earlier in his life, or in David's life. Verse 15, You know that the kingdom was mine, and all Israel had set their expectations on me that I should reign. Okay, this goes back to the events of chapter 1. Again, he was the next in line firstborn. He was secondborn, but the firstborn died. However, the kingdom has been turned over and has become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. So he recognizes that Jehovah was the one who chose Solomon. Okay? Verse 16, Now I ask one petition of you, do not deny me. And she said, Say it. He said, Please speak to King Solomon, for he will not refuse you, that he may give me Abishag the Shunammite as wife. Now, chapter 1, verses 1 on through verse 15 or so, we find out about Abishag. Okay, she's not listed as wife to David, but she was a young woman who comforted David. David never had any relations with her, but she comforted him in his old age. Okay? Whether you want to call her a consort, she wasn't a wife, but she wasn't a concubine. Again, there were no relations there. Just a companion, maybe you could say. But he wants to take Abishag as wife. So Bathsheba said, "Very well, I will speak for you to the king." So verse 19, Bathsheba therefore went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah. The king rose up to meet her, bowed down to her, sat down on his throne, and had a throne set for the king's mother. So she sat at his right hand. She said, "I desire one small petition of you. Do not refuse me." The king said to her, "Ask it, my mother, for I will not refuse you." She said, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as wife." Seems like a perfectly reasonable request. Okay? And supposedly Abishag was one of the most beautiful of the virgins that they could find to provide comfort to King David before he died. So Abishag obviously was very, very beautiful, very pretty. Seems like a reasonable request. Verse 22. King Solomon answered and said to his mother, "Now why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother. For him, for Abiathar the priest, for Joab the son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, "My God, do so to me and more also, if Adonijah has not spoken this word against his own life. Now therefore, as the Lord lives, who has confirmed me and set me on the throne of David my father, who has established a house for me, as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." Does that seem like an overreaction to you? He's asking for Abishag. Big deal. Okay? She wasn't even technically the wife of David.
You have insight to their motives, and you give this one thing, and then what's going to follow?
Yeah. I think Solomon had great insight here in understanding, even though she technically wasn't the wife of David, she was the last companion or consort to David. That being the case, the people held her in high regard for comforting their King David on his deathbed, but those last few years of his life. So even though she may not have been legally wife, at least nothing I've found suggests she was ever actually made his wife. And again, there were no relations there. In fact, the scriptures are very specific about that David never lied with Abishag. The people held her in high esteem. So if Adonijah marries Abishag, what might come from that? Another coup. Yeah, another coup. And I think that that's what Solomon is observing here. That maybe back in chapter 1, when Adonijah bowed down before him and acknowledged his kingship and so forth, I think that was just lip service. Solomon didn't know it at the time, because he's going to allow his actions to speak for him. This is why he said, if there's no wickedness found in you, you'll be fine. But now he's taking a step to try to retake that king, that position as king. And this is that step. In fact, his statement here, why not just ask for the kingdom also for him? Why not ask for Abiathar and Joab, in essence, traitors to the plan of the king, David? Whether they knew it or not, they were acting against David's command, and the Lord's command for that matter. And so this is why ultimately we see in verse 25, King Solomon strikes down Adonijah, and then he exiles Abiathar from being high priest, and this is kind of an interesting situation, that goes back to Eli. But then Joab, because of his role in this attempted coup against the plans of the king, he's executed as well. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that and the wisdom Solomon showed there, and then we'll talk about God giving Solomon so much even more wisdom and all of that next week. Thank you, everybody.